had this vision. I was going to give this nice Dharma talk today with a lot of profound Buddhist wisdom and base it on a few things that you can learn from the Holocaust. But the more I thought about it, the more I studied prayers from observances in the past and resources from places like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the more I felt I should do what the UN suggested that we do on this day. Remember. So here's what President Obama said about this in one of his speeches at a Holocaust observance during his term. We gather to mourn the loss of so many lives, to celebrate those who saved them, to honor those who survived, and to contemplate the obligations of the living. And I can't really think of any better way to spend a Sunday morning together than doing this. So let me just give you a little bit of extra background. Rita mentioned some of this earlier. The UN General Assembly designated January 27th as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And they chose this date because it coincides with the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the resolution urged all UN member states to honor the Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazism, and to develop educational programs in order to prevent future genocides. And the resolution also rejected any form of Holocaust denial and encouraged member states to preserve sites that the Nazis used during the final solution, such as concentration camps and killing centers. And affirmed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by condemning religious intolerance, incitement, harassment, or violence against persons or communities based on their ethnic origin or religious belief throughout the world. And so since then, since 2010, the UN has designated specific themes for the annual commemoration. This year's theme is Holocaust Remembrance, Demand and Defend Your Human Rights. The theme encourages us to learn from the lessons of the Holocaust and act against discrimination and to defend democratic values at a time when the global spread of neo-Nazism and hate groups fuels rising anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred throughout the world. So this year, so far, there's been a service on Friday with remarks from the German ambassador and reflections from Holocaust survivors. And today, there are audiences from 30 countries who will simultaneously watch a documentary about a group of journalists and scholars and others who secretly documented in writing the Nazi atrocities. And they buried 60,000 pages of these kinds of things in the hopes that if they didn't survive, that someday that these documents would be found and the truth be known. So by the way, International Remembrance Day is not the same day as Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust remembrance that's celebrated by a lot of Hebrew congregations, Jewish congregations. That particular day follows the Jewish calendar and falls on May 2nd this year. So you might have noticed I'm not Jewish. I do happen to be named after a Jewish person. There was a grocer in a little town in Texas where my father was born. And my father was named after him, and I was named after my father. And the story goes in the family lore that this was during the Depression, early in the Depression, and that my father's family didn't have any money to buy food with, and so the grocer extended credit to them so that they could feed their children. And in gratitude, they named my father after this grocer, and I was named after him. So on that level, I feel a little bit of connection to the Jewish community. And then I got a DNA test about a little over a year ago, and I do have a Jewish ancestor somewhere about 300 years ago. But I have been felt the importance of the Holocaust for a very long time. Since I was a kid, one of my great uncles was among the soldiers who liberated concentration camps in Germany during the war. And so I would hear stories about this. And one of my relatives gave me a book on the Nazi treatment of Jews. And so this was talked about in my family. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Hitler came to power in 1933, and I won't go into any detail, but he and his loyalists soon set about dismantling the German democracy. He was democratically elected. They also immediately began persecuting Jews, and initially by squeezing them out of the German economy. But as their power grew, so did the persecution. The violence reached its first crescendo in 1938, when the Third Reich started its territorial expansion. And anti-Semitism escalated in Germany, culminating on the 9th of November with Kristallnacht, a nationwide program organized by the Nazi regime. And on that night, most of the country's synagogues were burned down, and most of what Jewish shops remained were vandalized. In May 1939, a passenger liner carrying 937 people, almost all of them Jews fleeing Nazi persecution, left Hamburg for Havana, Cuba. And they had landing permits to enter Cuba, but Cuban laws changed on their way. The world was not showing a lot of sympathy at that point. And so the Cubans invalidated their landing permits before they arrived. And the passengers were almost all refused entry. The ship's name was the St. Louis, and it sailed along the coast of Florida within sight of Miami while passengers were desperately trying to get permission to land in the United States. The media was bringing attention to the refugees' plight, and some passengers cabled President Roosevelt asking for help and got no response. U.S. immigration policies at the time made it difficult for refugees to enter the country, in part because Americans were afraid they would take away their jobs. So the captain of the ship returned to Europe, where almost all passengers were admitted as temporary refugees by Great Britain, France, Holland, and Belgium. Most of them became trapped by the German invasion in the spring 1940, and over 250 died in the Holocaust. One of those passengers was Julius Hermans, who was residing in France when the Germans invaded. And after Germany occupied France, French authorities detained him in several concentration camps, where he was finally deported to Auschwitz, where he was murdered. By spring 1944, the Jews of Budapest had faced almost certain death at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Until then, the Hungarian government, who subjected them to discrimination and persecution, but they refused to permit deportation of them. So that was the only large Jewish community in Central Europe still intact by that time. But then Germany occupied Hungary in March 1944, and the newly installed authorities deported around 440,000 Jews to Auschwitz. So newspapers around the world were reporting on this stuff, but very few people tried to help. But there were a few who did, and they made a difference. Rufus Jones and Clarence Pickett were leaders of a U.S.-based Quaker Aid Society, and they became ardent advocates for expanding refugee assistance for children. They worked closely with welfare agencies to help Jewish refugees. In Britain, a woman named Lola Warburg was one of several prominent British and German Jews who convinced the government to allow Jewish children to immigrate to the United Kingdom. The first group arrived in December of 1938 with 200 children from a Jewish orphanage that the Nazis had destroyed on Kristallnacht. And so before it was ultimately halted by the outbreak of World War II, the rescue operation brought some 10,000 children, 3/4 of whom were Jewish, to safety in Great Britain. So I want to just share with you some stories. You know, to hear the history is one thing, and I'm so grateful that we heard the story of someone who's actually in this congregation. I think to hear these personal stories really brings to our hearts the importance of a situation like this. So Rudolf Bing was a Nuremberg lawyer who fled to Palestine with his wife in the late 1930s. And he explained that this way. He said, my wife and I were rudely awakened around 3 in the morning. We heard a frightening racket in front of the door of the building and saw a crowd of people standing outside in the dark. They were ringing all the bells, and we heard voices screaming, open up now. I immediately phoned police headquarters, and after giving my name, told them a mob is trying to push its way into my building. Are you Aryan? Asked a female voice. No, I answered, whereupon she broke off the connection with any further comment. We heard pitiful cries on the steps. A Jewish neighbor was evidently being beaten up. So we locked the door to our apartment, and then the door to our bedroom, which had an adjoining dressing room. We tied linen sheets together and fastened them to the crossbars of our window frame. We could already hear them breaking down our apartment door. The window of the dressing room overlooked a narrow alley with storage rooms on the other side. I threw a mattress down on the ground and jumped down. My wife was hanging by her fingertips from the window ledge. She let go and fell into my arms. We were saved. Clara Dijkstra was a housekeeper in Amsterdam, and she rescued a little Jewish girl named Nettie. And she told the story. She said, one spring day in 1942, I went to visit some friends, and there was a woman there named Sylvia Bloch. She was very shaken up because early the next morning, she and her husband had to report to go to work in Germany, truly to die afterward. They had been given a chance to escape, but the people who offered to hide them wouldn't let them bring their daughter. Why don't you give her to me, I said. I'll take care of her. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. What can I pay you to do this? She asked. Nothing, I answered. Nothing at all. She'd been almost hysterical, but now she calmed down. She left right away, saying she would bring her child to my place as soon as she could. A little while later, she appeared at my front door with 2-year-old Nettie. She had brought her stroller and her clothes. When Sylvia left, the child cried, Mama, Mama, but after a while she settled down and took a nap. When my husband came home, he looked at Nettie asleep in the stroller and said, What's this? She's ours, I said. I'll take care of her. I'll handle everything, and if the Germans come, just let me do the talking. My mother wasn't happy either. She said, don't do this, don't do it. But I told her, Mother, I love you, but it's already done. We have a child, a Jewish child. And then she said, well, good for you. Nettie's parents survived, and they were eventually reunited after the war, but Nettie remained close to Dijkstra throughout her life. Erika Ekstedt and her family survived the Holocaust partly because of a compassionate German stranger. She said, I remember the time in the Auschwitz ghetto when I used to take off the star from my coat and leave my ID and go out to look for food. I was always hungry and scared. I went to a store that sold food to the clergy because I knew my father had a priest who was a friend. It was easy for me to go out since I was blonde, blue-eyed, and spoke German fluently. One day I saw a German soldier beating a man on the ground. The man was bleeding. The soldier was on crutches and his chest was covered with decorations. He was standing on one of the crutches and with the other he was beating the man. I approached the soldier and in my perfect German lectured him on how wrong he was to beat up a man who couldn't defend himself. As I was busy giving my lecture, people stood around listening. All of a sudden a policeman touched my arm and said, that's enough, little girl. Come with me, I'll take you home. At that moment I realized I can't go home. If I take him to the ghetto, my whole family will be killed. So I took him to the home of an opera singer who lived not far from the ghetto. She was, of course, a Gentile. When we arrived at the door and rang the bell, this beautiful lady opened the door and I said, Mama. The policeman at the same time said, is this your daughter? She ignored him and pointing a finger at me, she said, I told you once, I told you twice, home and homework. The policeman in the meantime kept repeating the question, is this your daughter? And in desperation, she started slapping me in the face. It was so painful that I hardly cared what happened at this point. And then, as if in a dream, I heard the policeman saying, just keep her, just stop hitting her. And then he left. After he left, she took me inside, gave me a hug, and asked, are you from the ghetto? I've forgotten so many names from during the Holocaust, but I still remember her. Of the almost 800,000 Hungarian Jews in 1944, only about 250,000 survived the Holocaust. This is an excerpt from the report of the 3rd U.S. Army, who liberated Afling, which is a subcamp of Dachau, and included liberating some of the Hungarian survivors in 1945. Here on double-decked wooden beds, mere wooden slabs covered with filthy straw, were gaunt shadows of men with shaved heads, unulcerated legs, the unhealed whiplashes across their backs. They had pale faces and puffy ankles, the protein-deficient flesh that was unable to recuperate from even minor wounds. Numbers were tattooed on their forearms or across their chests. At the far end of the room, a nude skeleton sat on a barrel with a plank across it. He was supported by another skeleton who was standing. Rather, they leaned against one another in order not to fall down. The shells were filled with what had been men. Their bodies were naked or only partly covered by a scrap of tattered, dirty gray blanket. Some had enough strength to turn and extend their hands in our direction. Some just lay, staring with unseeing eyes and barely breathing. Colonel Herschel Schachter was a chaplain and rabbi with the army at the liberation of Buchenwald. And as he entered, he said, I shouted in Yiddish, greetings, Jews, you are free. I am an American rabbi. He said they were looking at me out of their big eyes, haunted, crippled, paralyzed with fear, emaciated, skin and bones, half crazy, more dead than alive. How they miraculously survived is still a mystery. The braver among them approached me, touched my army uniform, examined the Jewish chaplain's insignia, incredulously asked me over and over, is it true? Is it true? I went from barracks to barracks throughout the whole area called a small camp that was reserved for especially brutal treatment to Jews. And as I moved about, bands of Jews were following me, pouring out tales of woe, asking me over and over, does the world know what happened? What will happen now? Where will we go from here? By the time of liberation by American forces in May of 1945, Norbert Walheim had survived Auschwitz, slave labor, and forced march. And he said he remembered that day very well when he saw the American flag hoisted hanging from the trees in the forest near Schwerin, and realized that they had all just been reborn. He said, we received a new lease on life. We embraced each other. I was in a small group of people and laughing and then crying. It was a tremendous feeling of relief, but also burden, because we realized that this moment for which we had waited years and years we couldn't share with those we loved. And we also realized something else. We had no home left to go to. So I remember reading this and hearing these stories as a child and talking to my parents about this and saying, what? And wondering, could this happen here? And I was assured, no, it couldn't happen here. But some of the events that unfolded in the 1930s are uncomfortably similar to events that happen today. Not, in the rest of the world, in places like Bosnia and Rwanda and so on. But also scenes surrounding immigration and the vilifying and dehumanization of people of other religions, other cultures. The Holocaust happened in the heart of Europe. Germany was a democracy, renowned for its culture, its scientists. And Hitler was a strong man who considered his race superior and wanted to establish a worldwide empire open only to them. The death of millions could only be possible by people who followed orders, were loyal without questioning, and bystanders who did nothing. And so, I think the most important reasons to remember this are to recall that human beings are capable of this kind of evil. And then, as Obama said, remembering gives us a very important opportunity to contemplate the obligations of the living. I think the most important thing that could come about from a day like this is to remember the suffering and the efforts that were made to end it, and by doing, make sure that we are never the ones to contribute to it by standing in silence. But we also have to avoid hatred. There are a lot of people out there that want to divide us. But we can be strongest when we have the courage to renounce evil without losing our goodwill for others, without losing our own goodness. Regina Spiegel experienced Auschwitz-Birkenau, slave labor in Germany, and Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. She was liberated by the Soviet Army on April 20th, 1945, Hitler's birthday. Despite her suffering, she said she did not hate. We who survived Auschwitz and other concentration camps advocate hope, not despair, she said. We advocate generosity, not bitterness, gratitude, not violence. So may their memories be a blessing. I offer you a moment of silence.